Good afternoon, and welcome to Carthage Women in STEM, a live Zoom discussion. My name is Carolyn Frisch, and I'm the Director of Foundation and Corporate Relations for Carthage College. Thank you for logging in for what will be an insightful discussion. During tonight's event, you will hear from Mrs. Cameron Swallow, Dr. Deanna Burns, Dean of Natural and Social Sciences, and several distinguished female scientists. They will speak about the Kenosha Public Library's NEA Big Read book, Lab Girl, and their career experiences. Throughout tonight's event, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. We will have time in the end to address your questions. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Cameron Swallow. Mrs. Swallow, the wife of Carthage's president, John Swallow, taught secondary school math for 18 years, along with English and several other subjects along the way, but not science. She loves reading and book discussion groups, as well as projects like Kenosha's Big Read that promote literacy and community. She will give a brief orientation to the book Lab Girl, and then turn the meeting over to the panelists. Welcome, Mrs. Swallow.
Thanks a lot, Carolyn. Thanks for pulling us all together today. And welcome to everyone who is here. Carolyn is absolutely right. I love the Big Read. I love reading. I love community projects. I love women's history, especially the history of women in STEM like this. Now, to be honest, I don't love memoirs. And so I was a little nervous about taking on this book as the project for the year, but I was going to do my civic duty and I like it. I really am glad that I read this book, which I would not have read without an external pressure. And I was disarmed and charmed by her voice, by her childhood in the upper Midwest and the way she described feeling cozy and at home in the laboratory in her father's college where he taught. I was charmed by her quirky mind, capable of intense concentration on the one hand, and also these great leaps of association across disciplines on the other hand. I mean, when she was applying all those Dickens quotations to her hospital job when she was in college, I was just astounded. I was very moved by her deep appreciation for her neurologically different colleague, Bill. She was able to pick him out and noted a kindred spirit and a kindred mind, right? Ready for work, lifelong partnership work in this laboratory. And the portrait that she drew of that friendship that defined a whole new category of human relationship that there aren't very many models of in our world was just very moving to me. I appreciated reading about her medical struggles, her career struggles, her aspirations and how her gender and her financial capacity at different times limited those aspirations. And then all throughout, the way she described the science and how it interwove with the pieces of her own life. The plants and she have things in common, and she draws these parallels that you wouldn't normally think of. Her clear explanations of difficult scientific concepts that make science and research accessible, well, I found that very welcoming and almost comfortable. After all, she turned us all into scientists in one of those early scenes of the book, right? She sets us up. She says, well, now you're a scientist, so come and join me in this. So I'm now going to ask some female scientists to come and join us in this and give you their connections, that both personal and professional, to this wonderful memoir. And to introduce our panel is going to be one of our panelists, and as Carolyn said, the Dean of the Division of Natural Sciences at Carthage, Dean Deanna Burns. She is an associate professor of biology. She studies evolutionary ecology, particularly with bats. And she says she is inspired by the incredible beauty and cleverness of nature. Welcome, Deanna.
Thank you, Cameron, and thank you all for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce the rest of our panelists today. And what we are going to do is I'm going to introduce them and then ask them to share a little bit of the book, a piece that spoke to them and what resonated with them. So I'm going to start, and the piece that resonated with me first, there are many pieces of the book that resonated with me, but the one that resonated with me first that I underlined a lot and folded down the corner of the book is at the top of page 107, when she's describing Bill and says he can compare the dozens of soils he carries in his memory with one before him in bafflingly excruciating detail. The discovery of new colors and new combinations underground is what he loves most about his work. And the reason that spoke to me is I think what has inspired me to do the science work that I do is the beauty of it and the seeing the beauty and being struck by the differences in the beauty. And I think that all of us share that, and we each see something a little bit different that speaks to us and somehow just sticks in our brain and tells us that's what you should continue to work on. So that's my piece that jumped out first. It's my pleasure to introduce the rest of our panelists. The first one I'll introduce is Dr. Tracy Gartner. Dr. Gartner is a professor of environmental science and biology. She's the co-founder of ERIN, the Ecological Research as Education Network, a network of more than 350 colleges and universities that engage faculty and undergraduate students from across the country in coordinated research projects in the fields of environmental science and ecology. She teaches a variety of courses at Carthage, including botany and mycology, sustainable agriculture, and an array of environmental science courses. Her research specializes in interactions of humans, biodiversity, and the way ecosystems function, and she has found interdisciplinary and collaborative research projects to be particularly rewarding. Welcome, Tracy. What's your beat? What's your piece of the book?
Thanks so much. I think so many parts of this book spoke to me, in part because I do have that botany background and being able to, I loved how she started each chapter with something about the botanical world, and we were able to learn about that plant world while we were learning about her life. One of the things that really stood out to me was in chapter 8, when she's talking about the moment that she becomes a scientist. And I hadn't really ever thought about it being as a single moment in time until she put it in that framework. But one of the things that really struck me, and her story is her first time she did an X-ray analysis, and she discovers that a tree seed is made out of ruby, right? And so she gets this peak of ruby. That was her one moment. And so I started thinking about my one moment. And as part of that chapter, she says the transition, this is on page 66. She says the transition between doing what you're told and telling yourself what to do is the most difficult and terrifying thing that a student can do. And it's one of the things that you have to do in order to become a PhD student and to become a researcher. And so she says that this typically happens about halfway through. And I realized that I also have that moment, right? And my moment was the first time that I really felt comfortable sort of standing up to my advisor and saying, no, this is the way I interpret it, even though when it was a time when she was interpreting something differently. And so that happened probably halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, when I had to justify my statistical approach for how I was analyzing my data. And so it really was a moment of empowerment and a moment of feeling like, no, this is something I really can do on my own 2 feet. And I think that's such an important moment for all scientists to have.
Thank you, Tracy. Our next panelist is Dr. Andrea Henley. Andrea Henley is an associate professor of biology at Carthage. Her research is in the areas of cell biology and cancer immunology. She studies how melanoma develops and progresses by using a small model organism, the zebrafish. Andrea is also interested in space biology and enjoys sharing this exciting interdisciplinary field with her students. Her students frequently conduct research investigating how microgravity might affect the development of plants, organisms, and cancer cells. Her research and teaching have taken her all over the world, from Minnesota to Boston, Singapore, Taiwan, New York, and now to Wisconsin. Thanks, Andrea. What struck you about the book?
Thanks, Deanna. So I think that the book really resonated with me right away from the first chapter when she talked about her upbringing in Minnesota. I'm originally from Minnesota as well, and sort of grew up in some small towns in Minnesota and western Wisconsin. So I could really understand what she was talking about and how hard it is sometimes to break away from those small towns to go out and do sort of your own education or undertake your own adventures. But I'm glad that she shared those stories with us and talked about how she worked in a pharmacy first and what it was like to have to leave sort of that steady job to go and pursue an internship in a lab with more unknowns. That just really struck me personally because I feel like I've done some of this similar things as I've moved around the country following my research and my teaching positions. Another part that I just wanted to briefly mention was in chapter 7 on the top of page 129. She has this saying where there's some place where she's going to be part of the in group. And she's sort of talking about how eventually she might make it there when she's at conferences or workshops. She'll feel like she'll belong. And she also wanted to create that sense of belonging in her own group with her students. And for me, that just personally struck me as well. I feel like in recent years, through the space biology community, I've really found my niche in my home. And whenever I go to the space biology conference, those are the people that I love to share my science with. And they're excited to hear about what I'm doing with my students in the classroom. So I really thought that that particular saying that she italicized there, something that probably a lot of scientists go through to really find their field or their specialty, the place where they can network with colleagues and really feel like they belong.
Thank you, Andrea. The next panelist I have to introduce is Joy Mast. Joy Mast is a professor in current chair of the Department of Geospatial Science and runs the Dendrochronology Research Lab at Carthage College. She teaches courses in biogeography, soil science, forest ecology, field methods, geology, and GIS. Among her current research projects, Professor Mast is studying forest disturbances in the Southwest related to crown fires, insect epidemics, and severe droughts. Thanks, Joy.
Thanks, Deanna. So kind of like Andrea, I immediately liked this book because I'm from Minnesota. I am Scandinavian. My dad's a professor. And I'm like, boom, I got them all right from her immediately. And I study trees. So I was delighted with all the little small chapters that kept talking about trees all the way through. I also teach geology. And when I picked this up yesterday, I was reading a part of it again. And she was talking about the Eocene and 50 million years ago, there were swamps in the Arctic. I thought I taught that yesterday in process geomorphology, swamps in the Arctic. And I'm like, boom. So it was fun trying to think of, they said, pick your favorite. I did pick a favorite. It's kind of later on. So I am all the way down in page 189 on the bottom. And this is I'm going to read it and then I'll tell you why it's one of my favorites. It says, I reflected that we spent our lives working, but never really got good at our work or even finished it. The purpose instead was for me to stand on the rock that this is the gentleman from Cincinnati who gave all the lab equipment, had thrown into a rushing river, bend and claw another rock from the bottom, and then cast it just a little further down and hope it would be useful next step for some person to whom Providence might allow me to cross paths. So this popped for me because next week I'm giving a talk to a very large audience on Zoom in honor of my PhD and master's advisor who just retired after 45 years at University of Colorado. And I got invited to be a keynote speaker to say how he influenced my profession, which made me think I've been in this profession a long time, I think 32 or 33 years. So I am also getting to the senior years of my life as a researcher. And so it strikes me that I can pick up from someone who's much more famous than I am, but did a great job with mentoring and all his grad students. I've had my own PhD and master's students. Right now I'm in an undergraduate institution. So I just came from a thesis defense right before this. How we then pass on that stone, skip down the rock. I like the geomorphology river part too. and how we can maybe influence the next generation of science researchers. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Joy. That's great. Our next panelist is Sarah Rubenfeld. Dr. Rubenfeld is an associate professor of environmental science at Carthage. She teaches courses in environmental science, environmental chemistry, and research design for both majors and non-majors. Her research focuses on the environmental fate of chemicals used in consumer products. In recent years, she has worked with undergraduate collaborators to investigate the effect of wastewater treatment on fragrance chemicals, the behavior of antibacterial hand soap in Lake Michigan, and the uptake of plastic chemicals by agricultural crops. Sarah, do you have a bit to share?
I do. Thank you, Deanna. And thanks to all of you for being here. So the bit of the story that really I connected with immediately was the story of her trip to Ireland. And she said that every trip that she take, they developed this habit of beginning by hiking to the highest point and just sort of looking around to see what was out there. I am a hiker and a backpacker for many years, and I love getting to the top points. So that resonated. But it also really connected to something that I often discuss with my students beginning in, the second class of their first year, which is the idea that science isn't a collection of knowledge. It's not a set of facts that you read in a book. It's a way of looking at the world and of noticing things that other people might not, and then asking questions about the things that you're seeing. And one of the things that I thought she really did effectively in this book was kind of give us an opportunity to ride along in her head and to see the world through her eyes. And see what she was noticing as she was looking around. Looking back kind of at my own training, the first time that I kind of became aware of that shift, I was an undergraduate and I spent a summer at a geology field camp in the Rockies. So there's, a group of students hanging out in this amazingly beautiful mountain meadow, and a professor is talking to us about the maps we're about to make. And it became clear as I was listening to him that in his mind, and sorry to all the botanists, all of the trees and the plants and the people and all of that other stuff, that stuff was just in the way. Like it was there, but you just had to sort of be able to peel it back to get to the really important stuff, which to him was the rocks underneath, right? And if he could just get rid of all that green stuff, he would have been thrilled. That's not necessarily how I see the world. And so that, I didn't take away that worldview, but the idea that part of what makes someone a scientist is kind of the way that you look at the world. And so the phrase that I pulled out, and I did not think to write down the page, but when she first talks about coming to Ireland, she says, Ireland is so saturated with green that it is the things that are not green that catch one's eye. And so to her, right, she is looking at this world and she is seeing a world of green because the green, right, is what she is passionate about and what she is focused on. And I think that thing is different for everybody. But the idea of figuring out what is that thing, what is that worldview that everything else gets processed to, I think is a really important transition as a scientist.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Yes, indeed. The last panelist that I have to introduce, last but not least, is Susie Stevenson. Susie is an assistant professor of chemistry at Carthage. She teaches lecture and lab courses in organic chemistry and organic synthesis. Susie's research is focused on the development of new chemical reactions. Specifically, her lab is interested in photocatalytic reactions that require light in order to proceed. Thanks, Susie.
Hi, thanks, Deanna. So I guess the part that resonated the most in the book with me was when she took the assistant professor job at Georgia Tech and moved from Berkeley to Atlanta. When I was in grad school, I had a somewhat similar experience as a grad student, not as starting my assistant professor job, obviously, but I was at a lab at Colorado State, and our entire lab moved to the University of Georgia. So we also moved to Georgia. And so I really connected with just, the idea of packing up a lab, moving to a new place, unpacking, starting over in a new space. We even had, at first when we moved there, we weren't able to move into our permanent research space. So we had a temporary space that was pretty run down and old. So it reminded me of her lab, which she said was just a bunch of drywall and just empty rooms. And we had all of our stuff in boxes in the basement, just a whole room of boxes. And she described a similar thing of when she was buying new equipment, just having a whole wall of boxes with her name on it. And I guess the other thing, just with her moving to Georgia and our lab also moving to Georgia, it reminded, well, I thought it was funny, her impression of the South versus my impression of the South as a scientist. Because for her, studying plants, I think on the first page of part 2 of the book, she says the American South is a plant's idea of Eden. And she talks about all the different types of plants that are able to grow in that climate. And so for her, it was a great, environment to be in. But for doing organic chemistry, the humidity in Georgia was actually kind of a problem, especially moving from Colorado to Georgia, where it's very dry, and Georgia where it's extremely humid. It actually affected our, the reactions that we ran in the lab, just the fact that the air was more humid. And so I thought that was an interesting difference between her impression and my own.
I can see that. Thank you, Susie. Well, thank you, all my wonderful colleagues. It's a pleasure to have this time to talk with one another about these things. I'm glad that we can welcome the rest of Kenosha to join us. I'll now turn it back over to Cameron, who's going to help us carry on a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, all 6 panelists, for sharing your connections, the way that your life and work can intersect and resonate with this memoir. I'm interested in a couple of other things. This being Women's History Month, I want to see what effect gender has on this memoir, her story, your stories about being women in the STEM fields where you are still clearly a minority by numbers. So she describes this really inhospitable world of conference papers and grant applications where she felt very much at a disadvantage as a woman. And I'm wondering, how would you describe that world, that landscape in the 2020s, and is it as stark as it was for her in the 1990s?
I can start since I'm probably the oldest. So I was actually in grad school in the 80s and I finished in 92 with my PhD. And I'm in a field of basically forestry. And I was in a lab I only had male mentors for my undergraduate honors at Madison and my master's and my PhD. I was in an all male lab and everyone had beards because that's very important for foresters to have a beard. And I had a lovely, delightful experience. So I was much younger than most of them. Most of them had done another career in forestry and came later to grad school. They had families. I was recently married, but I was 22. I had a lot of experience coming in as a very young looking woman in a very male dominated field for lots of forestry fire conferences. I'm still going to conferences where there are very few women that get invited, but I had not thankfully experienced what the book had experienced. I've been successful with my grant writing and successful at conferences, and I have not felt the some of the horrible things that she went through in the book. So I give a thumbs up to forestry for that.
Thank you, Joy. Anyone else want to speak about how Andrea?
Yeah, I feel like the field of biology has probably changed quite a bit since the 1990s. First of all, there are a lot more women that go into this field now. I see this in my classroom in particular. I have more female students than male in almost every class. And additionally, I feel like grants now are more geared towards early investigators. For instance, I think it was the top of page 168, she talked about how much she struggled as a new investigator, a new scientist, trying to get funding, competing with those who had been in the field for 30, 40 years. But now as a scientist, it's actually maybe a lot easier. If you're in the first 5 years of your career, there are grants specifically targeted for you that you can apply to. So you have a better chance of being able to get financial support for your research in your lab. Now, I can't say that those are always geared specifically towards women in science, but I feel like the odds are better now when there are grants that you'll be evaluated differently as a new investigator versus a senior investigator.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to add to that too, in that I think there's a really clear discipline specificity in this, and that I agree with both of my colleagues about changes in biology. I work at sort of the interface. So I go to a lot of soils conferences and I go to a lot of ecology conferences, and the audiences of those two groups are incredibly different. So like Joy was talking about, you go to a soils conference and it's all bearded men. You go and they wear suits, they look very nice. But you go to an ecology conference and it's much more diverse and much more informal. So I do think it's different. I was talking to a math colleague, a female math colleague, and she commented that when she goes to a conference, she feels like her presentation has to be 10 times as good as everybody else's presentation, because regardless of what she says, hers is the one that's going to be remembered because she's the one that's different and stands out. And so I think it's important to just recognize that we have come a long way, but we have a lot more room to continue to grow in all of our fields, but in particular, some of them more than others.
Thank you. It is encouraging to hear the story of number one, Joy's experience was not negative like the one in the book, and number two, there's been an evolution in the field since the 90s as well. My second question, I will pause before I ask it to ask our attendees if you have questions about the book or about the particular careers of our panelists and how they interact with this world of female scientific researchers. You can type it into the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That means if you hover your cursor over the bottom of your screen, this control bar will come up where you can see your mute button and your video button and the participant button. But the Q&A button looks like two speech bubbles together. And if you hit that, you'll get a window where you can type a question, and the words of your question will magically be transmitted to the panelists, and I will ask your question right here live on camera. So while you're figuring that out and typing your question in, I will ask my second question, which has to do with student interactions. The stories that Hope Yarns tells about field work with students and taking students out into the field and on these field trips and to the amusement parks and restaurants, and some of them were endearing and some of them were terrifying. I was holding my breath through some of them. So I wondered if you have similarly interesting, endearing, perhaps horrifying stories about student fieldwork. Deanna.
Yeah, I can jump in real quickly. I have taken a few students to the field as a graduate student. My fieldwork was in Southeast Asia and Papua New Guinea and the islands of the South Pacific. And so it was quite an adventure to go there myself and with other fellow researchers. And we didn't typically take undergraduates with us because we were doing our own graduate work. But there was a very precocious undergraduate student who was really interested in helping, and we could use the help, who decided that she could pay her own way and come with us. And it was pretty incredible experience for her. The place that we were working was very remote and very different culturally than any of us had experienced before. I had been there a few times already. And it turned out that we did get into a little bit of scariness, in that there was a particular male person who we were working with, who was a native of the area we were, who thought that this young student that we had with us was very attractive and he liked her. And nothing really came of that, except he had a crush on her, essentially, which caused all kinds of turmoil with his girlfriend at home and other relationships that we had to navigate. So it was very interesting. Everything turned out all right in the end, but I had never in my wildest dreams thought that I would have to navigate that kind of politics in doing field work with bats. So yeah, it can be quite an adventure.
Yes, thank you. Other fieldwork tales with students, Susie.
Sure. Well, this is not exactly a fieldwork tale, but it is kind of a field trip tale. So not last fall, but the fall before, we took some students down to the University of Chicago for a little conference, the Mid-States Consortium Conference, which was a lot of fun. We had a group of like 10 students, I think. And so I chaperoned with David Brown-Holland, who also teaches chemistry here at Carthage. He rented like one of those big vans that holds like 13 people, I think. So, large, very large van. And we drove everyone down in that. After the conference was over, it was Saturday night. And before we drove back to Kenosha, David had this idea that we should stop and get ice cream for everyone. And he knew this place that happened to be like in downtown Chicago in the West Loop area, which is, if you're familiar, it's a very like hopping area on a Saturday night, lots of restaurants, very hip. And so we're driving this giant 13-person van in, downtown Chicago. It was a little wild, and he's looking for a place to park. I couldn't find anywhere to park, obviously, because it's Saturday night. And so this story, I guess, is not quite as wacky as the ones in the book, but he ended up having to double park behind, a row of cars. And so we all like ran out of the van, tried to get ice cream as fast as we could, and then like piled back in, and it was fun. I think the students really enjoyed it. That's one of the stories that they told later on as one of their favorite memories from their time at Carthage. So it was fun.
But they didn't roll the van or end up on icy roads and having to go to a mechanic shop in the middle of a blizzard. And okay.
Right.
I'm
Thankfully, no.
Very glad to hear that.
Yes.
Let's see. Yes, we got 2 more fieldwork examples. This is a good topic. Go ahead, Joy.
Just to give a little background, I do a lot of research in national parks, and I've been working on Grand Canyon for years, and I'll bring field crews down, and I like hiring all women teams. It's something I like to do if I'm going to camp with someone for several weeks. It's kind of nice. One of the times we went down an unmaintained trail. So that means the National Park Service will not keep it as a trail. It was about 15 miles in with parts of it washed out. And I selected my crew very carefully. They all said they could do it with full packs and handle it. But we broke up and did it in segments. And by the time I got down to my thing, I found out that one of the persons turned back almost immediately, and she didn't give the food in her pack to anybody else. So there went our food. And a second one of my my own grad student threw out her hip badly enough that she medically couldn't go back up. And so we had to take all her packs and carry her down, and we couldn't get her out 15 miles deep in a canyon. There's no cell phone. So we had to leave my husband with a woman, my grad student who he'd never met before, to wait for some kind of a USGS boat to come in the next week with every bit of food we had left and all the gear that we could. He had to walk every day a couple miles and make the packs go back and forth to get it all set up. And then when they came, he had to beg for a ride just to get to a real trail. So here's a woman with her hip out, and they got to the main trail. She still had to hike the 10 miles out, but by then it was a little better. I had to turn around and hike back the next day with the rest of the crew, and I had lost 4 toenails because I had just hiked down with the iron boots, and I had to hike back with full gear. And I will never forget the Tanner Trail. We didn't get a single tree core. not a thing got sampled. So then we had to do it again. So field work is one of those. You be flexible. It doesn't always work, but you got to do it again. So I enjoyed that. I particularly liked the part of the book where she did all that wonderful, all those vials of the things, and she got to the airport and they threw it out because she didn't have a permit. And you have to kind of like live and learn from all of it. So that was my story.
And then they used that technique to test their future lab assistants, whether they could stand up to losing all their data and go back to the beginning and start over. Wow. Andrea, what is your field trip example?
Yeah, mine's not really field work. I don't do that too much in my area of expertise, but the chances where I get to know my students better is through travel to conferences. So I just wanted to share, like a couple of years ago, I had a student that I was working on a project with, and we were collaborating with NASA. So I went to the space biology conference, and that year it happened to be in Cleveland, Ohio, and there was an opportunity to go visit NASA Glenn, which is one of NASA's main centers around the United States. So we went on this tour there. We weren't quite sure what to expect, but all of a sudden we got to see all of the behind the scenes. They took us into a lab where engineers were working on developing rovers that were going to be sent to Mars. So we saw how they actually painstakingly developed the tires for these rovers so that they could go through the Martian soil and deal with the rocky surface there. And it was just sort of endearing to see my students' reaction to all of this and to see him get so excited about space research. We also got to go to the wind tunnel where they're testing, parts of wings of space shuttles or rockets and seeing how the engineering of that works. And we went to the drop towers where they mimic microgravity here on Earth by dropping an experiment hundreds of feet into the ground. So I know we're not doing field work, but I think that traveling with students, it really gives you an opportunity to bond with them, to get to know them better, and to see what excites them and potentially kind of place them into their future careers. You get to know where they might be headed after graduation from Carthage. So thank you.
Yes, thank you all. This is our first question from the Q&A app. Yay, our attendees have figured out the Q&A button in their Zoom screens. And they have said, a question from Jill, how did you all get interested in science? And that is a question I believe we're interested in hearing from all 6 panelists. So may I call on you in the order of my Zoom screen? To be efficient. All right. First in line is Sarah.
Okay. So I was not actually one of those children who fell in love with science at an early age. I liked it fine, but it was not a particular favorite of mine as a student. I was very much one of those people who was interested in everything. I wanted to do a little bit of all of the different things. And which is partly how I ended up with 3 majors in college, none of which were actually what I'm doing now. So don't panic, all you undecided students out there. Where I ended up with was kind of 2 things. One is that I had always enjoyed math. That was my favorite subject in high school. And what I loved about it was the problem solving aspect. It felt like a puzzle that I could manipulate these things and get an answer. But I wasn't sure I actually cared in math what the answer was. And it was interesting, it was fun, but I needed something that felt more applied to really keep engaged. And then when I took the history and the political science classes, which I also adored, it felt like we spent a lot of time talking about things without actually doing anything about them. And so I ended up kind of falling into science as sort of the combination of those 2 things, and that it felt like it was a place that used that sort of puzzle problem solving aspect of my brain that I enjoyed, but that made a difference, that did something where the answers to the puzzles were going to matter, and that we were going to learn things that were going to change the way that the world worked, even if only in a very small way. And that continues to be what I find most rewarding about what I do.
Thank you, Sarah. Next is Tracy.
Hi. So it's hard to say. There are so many things to draw on, but I think science has always been a language for me that I've been able to communicate with people that perhaps at times have been difficult to communicate with. And I say that as a botanist and a mycologist. So I can still talk to my father this day, regardless of differences in political beliefs, differences in worldviews, differences in all these things when we go morel hunting. I can, when I was young, my mother and I would go at the first sign of spring and we would check on the buds on the trees every day until they popped open. And so I can still, to this day, regardless of whatever is going on in our lives, communicate through botany with her. And I communicated with a good friend of mine in high school when she started a flower collection and I started a tree leaf collection just for fun, right? So there are ways to connect to each other in the world that relate to the things around us, the other living beings in the world. And I think I've been drawn to botany and mycology in particular because of that. And I use them to draw connections across disciplines and across people.
Thank you. Important. Yes, bypassing difficult human relationships by being able to use the natural world as a connection point.
Right.
We would all do well to remember that. Joy, you're next.
So I was always interested to become in medical field. So I went to Madison biochem, and I went through the honors program for biology. And there were 10 of us that year that graduated with honors. 9 of them went into med school, and I was the one that decided not to. So I spent my 4 years working in a toxicology lab with Agent Orange and doing fun things of decapitating rats and bleeding them out and doing all sorts of things I don't want to even describe to you because I'll probably have nightmares about it, and decided that I actually don't want to spend my summers in a lab. I want to spend my summers outside. So I went into ecology after that. So I've just moved on over to forestry, and I haven't looked back. So I've been very, very happy. Probably my upbringing going camping and being a Midwesterners that go up to north to the lake, go fishing and go camping, and all the national parks my parents took me to over the summer. I think it imprinted. So, and I'll give a shout out to Sarah. I like math. So I think my dad was always like, just don't give up on math. Math will take you anywhere. Stick with math. So I took his advice on that one.
Thank you, Joy. Next is Andrea.
So my interest in science really started in 6th grade with a very strong teacher that I had. They say that everyone has that one teacher that they remember that really imprinted on them. And for me, it's Mrs. Keeler at St. Joseph Catholic School in Menominee, Wisconsin. She was really the first teacher who gave us a chance to do hands-on experiments in science. Now, they were not anything like experiments I'd do in the lab, but it gave us an idea of what the scientific method is. And from that moment on, I was hooked on doing science experiments. That year, I also was encouraged by her to join the Science Olympiad, which maybe some of you have experienced, but that's usually like grades 6 through 12. Students can compete in events trying to build contraptions to solve a problem or to drop an egg off a tower and make sure it hasn't cracked when it hits the ground. So I did all of these different types of events in Science Olympiad, starting in 6th grade all the way up to my senior year in high school. And I can pinpoint all of that back on Mrs. Keeler being the one to inspire me to consider science.
That's a story to warm this middle school teacher's heart. Thank you. Deanna, you're next.
Well, I think I can continue that thread. I think my story is a combination of Andrea's and maybe Joy's. I grew up in rural Wisconsin, and so I spent a lot of time outside. And my father and his brother ran a junkyard / garage, so I was always tinkering with things and wanting to know how things worked. So I think my upbringing kind of predisposed me to want to know how that works and to be comfortable and loving to be outside and always working outside. but I wasn't sure that I wanted to study science. I knew when I graduated, when I graduated from high school, I was torn between studying biology and art. And my biology and my science interest probably was sparked by Mr. Rutherford, who was my 5th grade science teacher, and we did lots of experiments in class that I thought was fun, and I was good at it. But when I got to college, one of my first jobs as a student, one of my work study jobs, was to assist a professor who was doing bird banding along the Mississippi Flyway. And so being outside, loving to be outside, getting close to nature, holding a bird in my hand was just the transformative experience that made me want to continue to study animals outside. And that's when I decided to change my major. So I think it's a combination, but I think it echoes a lot of what our colleagues are saying.
Thank you, Deanna. And Susie.
Yeah, I think I have something similar to Deanna. I've always enjoyed chemistry, but I was, when I went to college, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to major in. I was considering political science or chemistry. And so I, started taking classes in both, because at my college, we didn't have to declare majors until at the end of our sophomore year. And so I didn't declare at first. And then in my sophomore year, I took organic chemistry, which is what I currently teach and what I currently do. And I just loved it. It was like my favorite subject ever. I liked it more than any of the chemistry I'd learned before. And so that's what really sold me on chemistry. And the rest is history, I guess. I got to do some undergraduate research at my college, which is what kind of, I enjoy the hands-on aspect of chemistry, especially organic chemistry, because you run reactions, you convert chemicals into new chemicals. And I think the idea of organic synthesis was something that really interested me in being able to, synthesize like drug molecules and learning why organic chemistry is so important. But yeah, so ultimately it was just taking organic chemistry. That's what sold me on it.
Power of an important class. We do have another contributed question. Oh, okay. The other contributed question has come from our Kenosha Public Library staffer here tonight, and he would like to know, what have been your biggest struggles, career struggles, and how did you overcome them? I will not dictate the order this time, and I will be mindful that we have 12 minutes remaining in our Zoom webinar. But what have been your biggest struggles in your careers, and how did you overcome them?
So I can start on that one because I'm someone who found getting to where I am actually quite a bit of a struggle. I spent a longer time in graduate school than many people, and had conversations about whether I was going to stick it out or not, and whether I could stay even if I wanted to. Part of where I ran into trouble was that I was trying to analyze some samples, and the analytical techniques just weren't working. As she says in the book, once you reach a certain level of science, there's no procedure for you to follow, right? And no guarantee that if you follow the procedure correctly, you'll actually get an answer, let alone the right answer. And so I spent about 2 years on work that was not producing any answers at all. And really had to kind of figure out, how do I reset? How do I find a way, rather than kind of banging my head against this brick wall, how do I find another pathway to get to some place that I want to be? Part of that, I think, was being flexible enough to accept that the thing I was doing wasn't working and I needed to find another pathway. Part of it was accepting that that other pathway was not going to give me the quality of work that I had once hoped to create, and the goals, not all the goals I'd once had, I was going to be able to achieve, but that if I was willing to be flexible, that I could find something that I could do that would be meaningful, that would still kind of get me in the long run where I wanted to be, which is where I am now. And that's actually thing I often talk to, even with my students as they're thinking about projects, is that one of the ways to be successful as a scientist is to choose a plan with multiple pathways to success, where there's no one, where if any one thing goes wrong, there are other ways to get around that and still end up with something of value, even if it's not the thing that you originally were hoping to get.
Thank you. Other tales of struggles overcome. Tracy.
I guess I want to speak about this because I have a lot of students bring it forward to me. And I just want to make sure that everybody knows that this is a very common thing, and that's the imposter syndrome. So I think so many of us feel like at some point we weren't good enough, we were in the wrong spot, we weren't going to be able to make it through. There were lots of places where you get rejected a lot as a scientist. You're applying for grants, and as Hope Jahren is so eloquently put in her memoir, you get rejected from those grants frequently. You submit papers and you get rejected and have to revise and revise and revise. And so there are lots of moments through a graduate career and beyond where you have to continue to get back up and continue to keep going. And I guess I would say what helped me continue to do that is really great mentorship. So seeking out other graduate students, other colleagues, your mentors along the way, and being honest about where you are and what you're thinking, so that we can more aptly say, yes, we've all experienced that and we have all been there, and it's part of the job. But you are qualified, and it's okay to sort of fake it till you make it, and you're not actually faking it, right? You're doing fine.
Thank you. That's encouraging words, Tracy. Who else has a struggle overcome story? Andrea.
Yeah, mine has more to do with graduate school. I had a very difficult time for probably the majority of my graduate school years, and a lot of it boiled down to my mentor and I not always seeing eye to eye on the project, not communicating well together. I think some of that was because I went into graduate school very young, straight out of undergrad. So I didn't have any experience working in the real world beyond like cashier positions in high school. But through that, I had to really learn how to advocate for myself and make sure that I was keeping a record of our communication so that I could follow up with my mentor and tell him what we've talked about before, or seek help elsewhere. Like Tracy was saying, make sure you have really good mentorship and support. Well, I learned, if I wasn't getting that from my own mentor, I had this whole thesis committee of mentors and collaborators I could go to. So I always had to learn, and it took, unfortunately, a couple of years, learn how to, seek that help elsewhere, make sure I was getting the support I needed to be able to continue in the project. And like Tracy said, that imposter syndrome is real, but eventually you learn in graduate school that everybody's in the same boat, and you just have to kind of overcome that and push through it. You wouldn't be there if they didn't think that you could finish the PhD. They don't accept you into the program if they don't think you have what it takes. So eventually you learn that, and you learn how to be professional and communicate clearly with those around you to get your work done.
Thank you. Deanna, you were mentioning something? Yes.
Yeah, my story might follow Andrea as well, because I think one struggle that comes to mind most quickly is when in graduate school, and not because I had gone back to graduate school after having worked for about 7 years in the pharmaceutical industry. So I came back to graduate school also with a different mindset than most of the graduate students that were there, and most of their mentors. Most of the expectations they had for their graduate students did not fit my adult lifestyle at the time. So I had kind of a crisis of purpose, I guess, in that things were going fine. My work, I was working on a master's project first before jumping into my PhD, but I got to the point where I just thought, like, what is the purpose of this? And it makes me think about the diversity of scientists as well. And something that was brought up in one of our earlier conversations about this book is that what she's describing as the research environment is not what everybody's research environment is like. We at Carthage are primarily educators, and we are researchers and scientists as well, but we're doing our research to learn new things and to contribute to new knowledge. But we're also doing this because we want to teach our students, right? So the pressures are a little bit different. The focus is a little bit different. It's different than, say, a large university where you're a university researcher and your life really does depend on whether you're going to get a grant, whether you get papers published, et cetera. So there's a whole diversity of that. But all of us who have PhDs have had to go through that other process of a big graduate program where grants and papers and publications are how you succeed. And so at that point in my time, I was like, why am I spending all of my time doing this? What is the purpose of this? Because it was kind of curiosity science, right? It was trying to describe something that I just could not see the application to. And I think I was tired and frustrated. And I remember my advisor, who I didn't get along with always very well for other reasons, was trying to talk me into keeping going and saying, like, Deanna, you never know when somebody is going to find what you're describing here useful. You don't know how this will be applied in the future. And theoretically, I understood that, right? That's what science is about, contributing to the base of knowledge, that it's going to go out there and somebody is going to find it and be able to use it at some time that you do not know how. But at that point in time, I was coming from industry. I was getting tired. I just wanted to know, like, what is my purpose here? And so I think I just stuck with it because I really liked the work, right? I liked the work. And then I found this diversity of ways that you could continue to be a scientist. And I got involved in educational programs and teaching. And that's what helped me continue to stick with it, because I knew then, well, I could continue to do this and do something else. Also, I could have teaching and educating as a big part of what I do. And then that made me feel like, yes, okay, then this is worth it. This is why I'm doing this.
Yes, thank you, Deanna. Joy, something to add?
I just wanted to segue off of that since it worked real well with Deanna. So I went through, after my PhD, to a doctoral one large university, and I went through the whole process of getting my tenure and getting the promotions, and it was the biggest thing to try to get out of teaching. So that was the biggest goal always. How much grant money could I bring in to buy out of my class, especially my undergrads? I didn't want to have to teach them because, you want to teach your grad classes. And a very different whole mindset. And it's a very productive mindset. It's a very high pressure mindset, because if you bring in grad students, you have to fund them. And I felt that in this book in particular, all her feelings that she was worried about Bill and would she be able to fund him. And that's becomes just a massive part of your job. You become a grant writing organist because you just need to fund the people you promised you to fund them. And transitioning to Carthage, pretty long time ago, 2002. So almost getting close to 20 years. And first thing they told me is, you never buy out of your classes ever. You got a 313 and don't even ask. And the whole mindset of not competing against departments for who gets the grants, not competing against departments of who gets to teach a certain class or who brings in the grad students. And very, very nice mixing of the faculty in offices. You got to meet all the different departments, and the very supportive women scientists, all scientists between divisions. It's been delightful. It's been just a really neat new way to think about how to teach science, and kind of that work-life balance, which I thought maybe she got off a lot in that book, where she maybe would have had a healthier dynamic to not work all weekend long and through some of those things. But I think it's been a delight, and I thank Carthage for that.
Thank you. Well, we are at 5:30. Susie, I hate to cut out our very last panelist. But I'm going to keep to the timetable. You will remain the woman scientist of mystery. We'll all come looking for you to hear your stories. But I want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank Carolyn for putting it together. I want to thank the Big Read of Kenosha and the Kenosha Public Library System for writing the grant, speaking of grants, to make this month of activities possible. And I want to thank our audience for being here, for reading books, for participating in community discussions, for making community events go, and this year, man, for helping redefine what our sense of community is. I mean, in future years, I hope very much to be seeing all of you in person again, but meanwhile, man, am I thankful for Zoom. So with that said, we can all look forward to the pleasure of an instantaneous commute home. Thanks for coming, and good night.